The streets of Bogotá pulsed with chants, the rhythmic beating of drums, and the flutter of red, black, white, and green flags. What began as a solemn march in solidarity with Palestinians turned into a vivid and at times confrontational display of anger and urgency. The demonstration came just a day after Israeli naval forces intercepted the Global Sumud flotilla, a convoy carrying humanitarian aid destined for Gaza. Hundreds of Colombians, many young students and activists, filled the capital's main squares and avenues on October 2, 2025. They demanded stronger international action against what they described as Israel's aggression and called for the immediate release of the flotilla's passengers, which included Colombian nationals. From the early hours, groups assembled outside government buildings carrying banners emblazoned with slogans like Free Gaza and Stop the Blockade. The protests were a spontaneous reaction to the widely circulated video of the flotilla's interception, an event that had reignited global criticism of Israel's blockade on Gaza. Witnesses described the scene as electric, yet tense. Columns of demonstrators marched through Bogotá's central streets, waving giant Palestinian flags that rippled above the crowd like a river of colour. Keffiyehs were wrapped around shoulders, worn as both cultural symbols and political statements. At one intersection, groups of protesters danced defiantly in front of police lines, some spinning and chanting, while others raised fists high in the air. The air was thick with slogans, many directed at Colombia's own government, demanding it take a firmer stance against Israel. The situation grew heated as demonstrators pulled down police barriers erected to keep the march contained. Chants gave way to angry shouts as some protesters hurled rocks at riot police. Sparks flew, not just metaphorically, as several barriers were set alight, flames licking at the graffiti-streaked metal. For several hours, the plaza became a stage for an uneasy standoff between demonstrators and law enforcement. The fire from the barricades cast flickering shadows on the crowd, while the chants for Palestinian freedom never ceased. Walls and pavements across central Bogotá were soon marked with graffiti, messages denouncing Israeli military actions, calls for international solidarity, and appeals for President Gustavo Petro to intervene. One prominent mural read in bold letters, "No more silence for Gaza." Many protesters paused to photograph the graffiti, treating it as both testimony and tribute, a visual record of their frustration and their hope for justice. The scene was not merely one of confrontation, it was also an act of collective expression, channeling a sense of helplessness into words and symbols etched across the city's walls. Among the demonstrators was Pedro Mujica, a 23-year-old student from the Universidad Pedagógica Nacional. He held a megaphone in one hand and a Palestinian flag in the other as he addressed the crowd. Pedro Mujica said, "It is a concerning situation, the kidnapping carried out by the forces of the genocidal state of Israel against the Global Sumud flotilla carrying the Sumud, and above all, a threat to Colombia. Therefore, the Colombian people must unite and demand, and we also ask President Gustavo Petro and international human rights organizations for the prompt release of the Global Sumud flotilla and our Colombian colleagues." His words drew loud cheers and chants from those gathered. For many in the crowd, the interception of the flotilla was not just a distant geopolitical event, but a direct affront to Colombia's citizens and values. Standing nearby was Diego, an 18-year-old who chose not to reveal his surname, but whose voice carried unmistakable anger. Diego said, "The truth is, initially I'm very outraged because this is an act of crimes against humanity, against all of humanity. Speaking of the Colombians, the Colombian state has already declared itself against that genocidal state, referring to Israel." His remarks reflected a sentiment shared by many that the issue had moved beyond regional politics to one of universal human rights. The Global Sumud flotilla had set sail as part of a long-standing international effort to deliver humanitarian supplies, food, medicine and basic necessities to Palestinians in Gaza, a territory under blockade for years. Its interception in international waters sparked protests not only in the Middle East but across continents, including South America. The fact that Colombians were among the passengers elevated the incident from a distant crisis to an urgent national concern. President Gustavo Petro's administration had already signalled a critical stance toward Israel's policies in Gaza, but protesters in Bogotá insisted that words were not enough. They demanded concrete measures, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and active involvement in securing the release of the detained activists. Despite the confrontations with police, the protest remained overwhelmingly a grassroots display of solidarity. Ordinary citizens, students, teachers, workers and families took to the streets carrying hand-painted placards and chanting in Spanish, "Palestina libre," free Palestine, and "Libertad para la flotilla," freedom for the flotilla. Some demonstrators formed human chains to keep the more confrontational elements from escalating clashes with security forces. Others distributed leaflets explaining the history of the blockade and the humanitarian situation in Gaza, underscoring that their protest was rooted in a broader plea for justice. The march moved through key avenues of the capital, often pausing in front of government buildings and foreign embassies to deliver speeches and demand action. As night fell, the protest tone grew more intense. Several makeshift barricades were toppled and set on fire. The flames illuminated faces marked by anger and determination. Police in riot gear stood in disciplined rows behind their shields, at times pushing forward but mostly holding their line to avoid further escalation. Videos circulating on social media captured both the confrontations and the moments of unity, a reminder of how quickly scenes of solidarity can turn volatile under the weight of political tension. Activists used the protest to amplify calls for international pressure on Israel, arguing that statements of condemnation were insufficient in the face of what they described as systemic violence and blockade-driven suffering in Gaza. Many speakers framed the flotilla's interception as part of a broader pattern of suppressing humanitarian aid. They emphasized that Colombia, as a member of the global community, had a moral duty to act. In one particularly resonant speech delivered from the steps of a public building, an activist declared that silence from the international community would make them complicit in the ongoing crisis. The crowd responded with chants of "No más silencio," no more silence. The demonstration in Bogota was part of a growing wave of protests worldwide, from Europe to Latin America, condemning the blockade of Gaza and the flotilla's interception. The involvement of Colombians in the flotilla not only personalized the issue for many in the crowd, but also fueled a sense of urgency in demanding government action. While the protest's immediate impact on policy remains uncertain, it has added Colombia's voice to the international chorus calling for accountability and an end to the suffering in Gaza. As the night wore on and the crowd thinned, the flickering light from burned barricades gave way to the steady glow of street lamps. Graffiti remained on the walls as a silent testament to the day's events. For many participants, the protest was as much about expressing grief and outrage as it was about solidarity. They saw their struggle intertwined with that of the Palestinians, two peoples separated by continents but united in their view by a shared fight for dignity and justice. The voices of Pedro Mujica and Diego encapsulated that sentiment, a call for unity, action and accountability. Their words echoed through Bogotá's streets long after the marchers had dispersed, joining the global demand for an end to the suffering in Gaza and the release of those detained from the Global Sumud flotilla. It is a concerning situation. The kidnapping carried out by the forces of the genocidal state of Israel against the Global Sumud flotilla carrying the Sumud, and above all, a threat to Colombia. Therefore, the Colombian people must unite and demand, and we also ask President Gustavo Petro and international human rights organizations for the prompt release of the Global Sumud flotilla and our Colombian colleagues. The truth is, initially, I'm very outraged because this is an act of crimes against humanity, against all of humanity. Speaking of the Colombians, the Colombian state has already declared itself against that genocidal state, referring to Israel.